Ever feel like you're just scratching the surface with really complex issues? Like, say, understanding why a country faces instability. You hear endless debates, but getting to the core reasons, it's tough.
It really is. And Ethiopian politics is definitely one of those incredibly complex areas. So much history, so many different perspectives swirling around.
Exactly. So today, we're going to try and cut through some of that noise. We're doing a deep dive into the causes of political instability in Ethiopia.
And we're grounding this whole discussion in the source material you provided, Fikadu Hailu's work, OIY, which translates to what is the question?
Right. It's about getting past those sort of surface-level takes and really trying to understand the fundamental why. That's the mission here.
And Fikadu's piece gives us a great structure for that, actually. It's essentially a response to another writer, Eyasped Tesfaye, and his ideas for a stable political system in Ethiopia.
Yeah, so we'll basically follow Fikadu's approach. First, we'll unpack Eyasped's main arguments as Fikadu presents them. Then we'll get into Fikadu's critique of those arguments.
And finally, Fikadu adds some of his own ideas, things he thinks Eyasped might have missed or didn't quite emphasize enough.
It's a good way to look at it. Thesis, critique, and then additional thoughts.
Yeah.
Should give us, and you listening, a pretty rounded view.
Definitely. Seeing the arguments and counter-arguments side by side, that often helps clarify things.
Okay, let's dive in then. Starting with Eyasped's thesis, according to Fikadu. The absolute core of Eyasped's argument seems to be this. Achieving a stable government, a stable state in Ethiopia, hinges on building a common national political identity.
That's the bedrock for him. Without that shared identity, everything else is, well, unstable.
So what does he think is needed to actually build that stability? Does he lay out some prerequisites?
He does. Eyasped points to 4 key things. First, a government administration that actually has popular support, legitimacy.
Okay, makes sense.
Second, the rule of law and accountability, meaning leaders aren't above the law. Third, just general peace and stability across the country. And fourth, meeting basic development needs for the population. Food, jobs, that kind of thing.
But he thinks there's something even more fundamental missing.
Exactly. He argues that underneath all that is a deeper problem, a basic lack of acceptance of the Ethiopian state itself. And tied to that, the failure to build a real shared political community, it's like, the foundations aren't solid.
And why does he think that acceptance is missing? What's his diagnosis?
Well, he points to a couple of really key things, Fikadu notes. First, even though Ethiopia wasn't colonized by Europeans in the same way as many neighbors,
Right, famously so.
Eyasped argues it still failed to clearly define its own borders in a way that gained universal acceptance internally. And second, as anti-colonial movements were rising elsewhere in Africa, he says Ethiopian ethnic elites got inspired and launched their own sort of liberation movements within Ethiopia.
Interesting. So the state's formation and these internal nationalisms are deeply intertwined from Eyasped's viewpoint.
Very much so. And he contrasts Ethiopia's experience with Europe's nation-building process.
That's so.
He points out that things like large-scale industrialization, widespread formal education, and developed mass media things that helped forge common identities in Europe were less present or developed differently in Ethiopia.
So fewer shared experiences, maybe?
Yeah.
That cut across different groups?
Kind of. And he adds another layer related to the core state. He argues the initial political community, the core, was relatively small compared to the total population.
Okay.
This led, he suggests, to assimilationist policies trying to absorb other groups into that core identity.
Which I imagine didn't always go down well.
Precisely. Eyasped argues these policies actually fueled the very liberation movements they were trying to prevent. Sort of backfired.
Right, a classic case of unintended consequences.
Exactly. Which brings us to nationalism. Eyasped sees nationalism as absolutely central to Ethiopian politics. He breaks it down into 4 main types.
4 types. Okay, let's unpack those. What's the first one?
The first he calls Abyssinian, or Habesha, or sometimes Amharic nationalism. He links its origins to Orthodox Christianity, a sort of shared Habesha appearance, and the Amharic and Tigrinya languages.
And how did it evolve, according to him?
He traces it through Menelik II's expansion south, creating what he calls an Ahara class. Then later, Tigrayan nationalism emerges more distinctly, especially after Emperor Yohannes V's death and the division of Tigrinya speakers.
So internal dynamics even within that broader category.
Right. And then he notes a more assertive Amhara nationalism rising more recently, say, post-1985 constitution, and especially after political shifts around 2010.
Okay, that's the first type. What's next?
Second is Oromo nationalism. He sees its modern roots in an attempted federation during the Italian occupation.
Interesting historical link.
Yeah, and post-2010 especially, he identifies three main strands or aims within Oromo nationalism. First, some groups aiming for a fully independent Oromo state.
Like the ONLF example he apparently uses. Though ONLF is Somali Ogaden, maybe he means OLF. Let's stick to the source's claim. Maybe it means Oromo National Liberation Front in this context. Or maybe it's an error in the source summary. We'll report it as OLF seems more likely for Oromo nationalism.
Okay, let's assume OLF aiming for independence. Second, groups like, say, the Oromo Federalist Congress, OFC, pushing for genuine self-administration within Ethiopia.
So working within the federal system.
Right. And third, a strand associated perhaps more with the Oromo People's Democratic Organization, OPDO, now part of the ruling party, aiming to reshape Ethiopia more in line with Oromo interests and identity. Quite different goals there.
Definitely reflects a diversity of views.
Yeah.
Okay, what's the third type of nationalism?
Somali nationalism. Eyasped argues this was really shaped by the incorporation of the Ogaden and Hod regions into Ethiopia around World War II.
Right, a major historical point for Somali identity in the region.
Absolutely. That, plus the rise of the Pan-Somali movement aiming to unite all Somali territories, and then the formation of the Ogaden National Liberation Front, ONLF.
And does this also have different strands?
Yes. He mentions it includes those wanting an independent Ogaden state, those seeking self-administration within Ethiopia, and those who still hold on to the goal of joining a larger, unified Somali state.
Okay, so Abyssinian Habesha, Oromo, Somali. Did he mention a fourth? The outline mentioned 4 types, but only detailed 3. Let's assume for now these are the main ones Eyasped focuses on, according to Fikadu.
It seems the outline might have implicitly grouped Amhara and Tigrayan as distinct within the Abyssinian frame, making 4 threads if counted separately. But yes, those 3 broad categories seem key to Eyasped's analysis of nationalism's role.
Got it. So that's Eyasped's diagnosis.
Yeah.
Lack of common identity, fueled by these competing nationalisms with the deep historical roots. Now, what about his solutions? Where does he think Ethiopia should go?
Okay, solutions. First up, he looks at national dialogue.
A common suggestion in conflict situations. What's Eyasped's take?
He sees it as necessary, definitely. You have to talk. But he's skeptical it can be the single solution.
Why the skepticism?
He points to, well, limited success in other countries, apparently, and also flags what he sees as flaws in Ethiopia's own attempts at dialogue so far.
Yeah.
So helpful, but not a silver bullet.
Okay, what else does he propose?
His second idea is elite negotiation. But crucially, not just about carving up power.
Not just power-sharing deals.
No. He stresses it must involve rebuilding the actual legal and institutional frameworks of the state, going deeper than just who gets which ministry.
That sounds much more fundamental.
It is, and this leads him to critique some standard power-sharing models like consociationalism or centripetal democracy, models designed for diverse societies.
What's his issue with applying those models in Ethiopia?
He argues that while they might prevent outright conflict sometimes, they don't necessarily lead to effective governance, which is crucial, and they don't guarantee that you'll actually build that unifying national identity he sees as essential.
And he thinks they miss context.
Yeah, he feels they don't fully account for the African context, the extreme multi-ethnicity, maybe less developed civic cultures, and the whole issue of ethnic groups living across borders.
Mm-hmm.
Plus, he criticizes the Ethiopian constitution itself for lacking clear, unifying civic values, and as we mentioned before, for not having a constitutional court. Big gaps, in his view.
So, if those models aren't quite right, what structure does he propose?
This is where he gets quite specific. He suggests a directly elected president. They'd need over 50% of the vote nationally, plus a minimum level of support in different regions.
Okay, trying to ensure broad legitimacy.
Right. And here's an interesting twist. If the election is close, say the winner gets 60% and the loser 40%,
Yeah.
the loser automatically becomes vice president. Forced cooperation, essentially.
Okay, and if it's not close?
Then the winning president chooses their own VP. He also proposes a proportionally represented House of Representatives and, again, that crucial constitutional court.
He also mentions things like dual citizenship, Wolkate, Addis Ababa,
Yeah, it touches on those too, suggesting potential ways to resolve those specific long-running disputes. It's a pretty detailed blueprint.
It really is. But how would all this actually get implemented? Does he talk about the how?
He does.
Hey.
He says you absolutely need a nationwide political party to push these solutions through.
A new party. Because he doesn't think the existing ones can do it.
Pretty much.
Yeah.
He analyzes the current power balance, the ruling Prosperity Party, the TPLF, various rebels, and concludes none of them can currently overthrow the Prosperity Party on their own. So a new, broad-based party is needed.
And what would this new party do initially?
He sees it starting with grassroots mobilization, maybe charity work, community partnerships, building trust and presence. Then, longer term, competing strategically in elections to gain parliamentary power and eventually implement the reform agenda.
Okay, that's a comprehensive look at Eyasped's thesis and proposed solutions, as laid out by Fikadu. Now let's switch gears. What's Fikadu's critique of all this?
This is where Fikadu really presents his own perspective. He starts by saying, look, I agree with Eyasped that a common national identity is important, even necessary.
So, agreement on the goal.
Yes, but disagreement on the primary problem. Fikadu's main critique is that Eyasped focuses too heavily on competing ethnic nationalisms.
Right.
And doesn't give enough weight to what Fikadu sees as maybe the primary driver of instability, persistent authoritarianism, and the lack of real checks on power.
So shifting the focus from identity politics to the structure and exercise of power itself, that's a significant difference.
It really is. Fikadu emphasizes these recurring cycles of instability throughout Ethiopian history under the monarchy, the Derg, the current federal system, and links them directly to often violent power transitions, how power is won, and how it's lost.
So for Fikadu, it's less about which group is in charge and more about the way power operates, the rules of the game or lack thereof.
Precisely. He hammers home the need for a genuine social contract, a constitution that truly defines the relationship between the government and its citizens. Not just groups, but individual citizens.
And that means separation of powers.
Absolutely. Real separation of powers, and a system where government authority genuinely comes from the consent of the governed. Basic democratic principles, essentially.
He seems to be calling for much deeper systemic reforms than just managing ethnic competition.
Definitely. He also argues for a more careful look at how the Ethiopian state actually formed and evolved over time, and learning from other diverse societies that have achieved stability.
What kind of questions does he think need asking?
He throws out some big ones. How do states form and change? What's the ideal relationship between government and citizens? What kind of governments do peaceful countries usually have? How have diverse places managed to find stability? And crucially for Ethiopia, how do we break this cycle of political violence?
Those are fundamental questions for any society, really.
They are, and Fikadu also pushes back on how Eyasped treats the different nationalisms.
How so?
He thinks Eyasped analyzes them a bit too separately. Fikadu argues that their narratives are actually deeply intertwined. They influence each other constantly. Understanding those connections where they agree, where they clash, is vital if you want to build a common identity. You can't just look at them in isolation.
That makes sense. It's a web, not just separate strands.
Exactly. And Fikadu identifies two dominant, competing historical narratives shaping Ethiopian politics today.
Okay, what are they?
First, what he calls the Great Tradition. This narrative emphasizes continuity from the Solomonic dynasty through Haile Selassie, sort of a unified, long history.
The traditional narrative of Ethiopia.
Right. The second he calls counter-histories. These tend to see the modern Ethiopian state starting more with Menelik II's expansion, maybe emphasizing looser connections before that, and often viewing ethnic groups as having been separate entities brought together, sometimes forcefully.
And he sees a shift in which narrative is dominant.
Yes, he notes a shift from the Great Tradition being more dominant before 1991 to these counter-histories gaining more traction after 1991, especially with the rise of ethnic federalism. And this shift in historical understanding profoundly impacts how people see the state and their place in it.
Absolutely. How does Fikadu see these narratives translating into political forces today?
He outlines three main political camps emerging from these narratives. First, Traditional Ethiopianists, they focus on positive history, maybe downplay ethnic issues, and generally favor a strong central government and traditional values, often urban-based, maybe more mixed backgrounds.
Oh.
Second, ethno-federalists. They tend to see the state's history as one of ethnic oppression and believe ethno-linguistic federalism, if done democratically, is the answer. They want more power for the regions. Many Oromo and Tigrayan nationalists might fit here, pre-war, and many southern groups too.
Got it. And the third?
Third, secessionists. They see the Ethiopian state basically as a colonial construct established by northern groups with European help, and they advocate for their regions leaving Ethiopia altogether, like Eritrean nationalists before independence or groups like the ONLF or OLF historically.
That's a clear framework for understanding the major ideological divides. Does Figadu see any potential for these groups to evolve or converge?
He does suggest some potential shifts, maybe traditional Ethiopianism becoming more critical, possibly incorporating some ethno-federalist demands, leading towards a more civic Ethiopianism focused on individual rights. And maybe ethno-federalism focusing on group rights and regional power could consolidate into something like a two-party system. He sees potential, perhaps, for a unifying national party to emerge from these evolving positions.
But he also warns against focusing only on ethnicity, right?
Yeah. Yes, strongly. He says relying solely on ethnicity obscures other vital issues: gender, religion, class, regional disparities. He even suggests ethnic nationalism might have just shifted oppression from the national to the regional level in some cases.
So what's the alternative focus?
He calls for a comprehensive framework of citizens' rights, prioritizing civic values. Equal rights and obligations for everyone, acceptance of diversity, the rule of law, and protection for all minorities. Broadening the lens beyond just ethnicity.
Okay, let's turn to Fikadu's take on Eyasped's specific solutions. What about that government model, the President-Vice President Force Coalition idea?
Right. Eyasped's model, Fikadu acknowledges it could potentially increase government acceptance, maybe build in some checks and balances, which could help with rule of law and accountability.
So, some potential positives, but he has doubts.
Significant doubts. He questions if it could really build that common political identity Eyasped wants, or ensure effective governance, or ultimately bring peace and stability.
Why the skepticism on those fronts?
He worries about the potential for gridlock. You've got a president and VP possibly elected on competing promises, maybe with clashing ideologies. How do they govern effectively?
It could lead to paralysis.
Exactly. And constant political maneuvering, maybe, as they eye the next election against each other. He thinks this could seriously hinder effective governance, which is critical for a developing country like Ethiopia.
So the forced marriage might not lead to a happy or productive household, politically speaking.
That's a good way to put it. Fikadu also thinks the model assumes a simpler political reality than exists.
Like a two-party system.
Yeah, it seems to assume that, or at least non-fragmented voting. But Fikadu points to past elections, like 1997, where votes were split among many parties. What happens if no one gets 50%, or the winner gets, say, 30%? The model doesn't really address those scenarios well.
Practical implementation issues.
Right. And his final point on this is pretty blunt. Just having a popular party doesn't automatically mean you'll get credible elections. The whole environment matters.
Okay, so that's the critique of the government model. What about Eyasped's big idea of needing a nationwide political party to drive change? How does Fikadu assess that?
Fikadu's assessment here is, frankly, quite sobering. He looks at the current landscape and says the ruling Prosperity Party is basically the only truly capable national party right now.
Why? What advantages does it have?
It inherited a structure, has massive resources, controls the federal government and most regional states. Opposition parties, in contrast, he sees as fragmented, under-resourced, and generally weak.
And why does he think opposition parties struggle so much to bring about change? He lists quite a few reasons, doesn't he?
He does. It's a long list, really painting a picture of the challenges. First, the political space is incredibly narrow. The ruling party uses state power to suppress opposition, hindering their ability to mobilize, raise funds, organize, basically preventing strong challengers from emerging. Government and party are often blurred.
So it's not a level playing field.
It's not at all. Second, he talks about their inability to attract and keep active visionary members. People face real risks, imprisonment, surveillance. This breeds internal distrust. Leaders sometimes get dismissed as resentful youths or retirees, failing to inspire broad support. They even struggle just to field candidates sometimes.
That sounds incredibly difficult. What else?
Lack of clear alternative policies. Often they're just defined by being against the ruling party rather than offering a distinct unified vision. They struggle with internal policy agreement, too.
And funding. Always an issue for opposition groups.
A huge one, often reliant on diaspora funding, which can be unreliable, subject to external agendas, and can even fuel fragmentation. They just don't have enough money for basic operations, let alone expansion.
He also mentioned inclusivity issues.
Yes. Many parties end up looking like local associations, drawing members and leaders from the same area or ethnic group. National parties often lack real reach in key regions like Oromia, Somali, or Tigray. Ethnic parties can be dominated by specific clans, and there are big challenges, including diverse religious groups and women meaningfully. It often lacks strategic focus.
And finally, internal democracy problems.
Right. Difficulty changing leaders without the party splitting. Structures can be autocratic, built around personalities with no clear second tier of leadership. It all contributes to weakness and fragmentation.
So Fikadu is basically saying that for Eyasped's idea of a strong national opposition party to work, the entire political environment needs to change first.
Exactly. You need a space where opposition can compete fairly, recruit members without fear, raise domestic funds, develop policies through dialogue, and fix their own internal issues.
Which brings us back to elite negotiation. Fikadu sees this as potentially key to creating that fairer environment, right?
Precisely. He elaborates on this idea of a transitional forum of key elites, selected by neutral bodies with popular trust.
And what could this forum actually do?
He suggests it could jointly appoint leaders for crucial democratic institutions. The Election Board, Human Rights Commission, ombudsmen, media regulators, maybe even police commissioners, nominating neutral professionals.
So taking control of key institutions out of the hands of just the ruling party during a transition.
Yes. And the forum could also negotiate and decide on changes to election laws, institutional structures, and crucially, have the authority to enforce those decisions. The goal is to ensure a fair future election and prevent violence from any side.
A kind of managed transition mechanism.
Right, maybe for a limited time, say 3 years, with legal authority. This could allow peaceful political activity without destabilizing the country, while the existing government handles day-to-day administration neutrally.
But he acknowledges the government would likely resist this.
Oh, absolutely. Which is why he says a peaceful public movement would likely be needed to push them into accepting such a forum. It highlights that critical link between elite PACs and popular pressure.
This leads nicely into his next section on public movements for elite negotiation. He seems convinced that elections alone aren't a viable path for change in Ethiopia currently.
Yeah, he states that pretty clearly. And the alternative, armed struggle, just leads to bloodshed without guaranteeing a legitimate government comes out of it.
So he looks at how change has happened in other authoritarian contexts.
Right. He references research VDEM, National Endowment for Democracy, studies identifying common triggers for transition. Things like unexpected election defeats, big public protests, disputed elections, military losses, coups, or the autocrat suddenly dying.
Any patterns in what follows those triggers?
Interestingly, the research suggests democratic progress is more likely after unexpected election losses or disputes, especially in presidential systems, and significantly after major public protests.
So protests can be a real catalyst for positive change, according to this data.
It seems so, which reinforces Fikadu's point. Public movements are probably necessary to push the government towards reform or that elite negotiation table if something like Eyasped's model is ever to be realized.
But then Fikadu raises this really important warning about the theft of change. What does he mean by that?
He looks back at Ethiopia's recent past, specifically the aftermath of the 1997 elections. He argues that the subsequent crackdown on media, civil society, and parties left these sort of formless, leaderless movements, like the Oromia and Amharic protests, as the main drivers of pressure. They were hard for the government to stop because they were decentralized.
But the change that resulted?
He argues it was ultimately co-opted by new power players. He even compares it to how the Derg initially co-opted the revolution against the emperor. The movement creates an opening, but others can rush in and seize control.
So achieving the change is only half the battle. Preventing it from being hijacked is the other half.
Exactly. Fikadu says the real struggle begins after the window for change opens. Power vacuums get exploited.
And how does he think this theft can be prevented?
This is where he circles back again to elite negotiation. He believes movements must keep pushing insistently for a successful elite negotiation forum. That's the best way, in his view, to stop new oppressors simply replacing the old ones.
How would that help specifically?
It could prevent a total collapse of order during transition. It ensures the movement's diverse goals aren't just represented by one person or group who takes over, and it sets up a framework for longer-term change, not just a shift in personnel.
But keeping the movement's pressure up is key.
Essential. Even while knowing the government will likely label them terrorists, Fikadu sees change as inevitable, but the kind of regime that follows isn't guaranteed by change alone.
Which leads him to call for a publicly developed roadmap for change movements. What would that involve?
He envisions scholars, activists, political actors, others collaborating to clearly define things. What are the core problems with the state and past governments? What are the different visions various Ethiopian groups have for the future? Where's the common ground? Where are the disagreements?
And critically, what structural changes are needed to bridge those differences?
Exactly. He says this roadmap needs to tackle the big thorny issues head-on. Federal structure, borders, form of government, language rights, secession, land ownership, the economic model, all of it.
Where could this work realistically be done?
He suggests maybe initially in safer places outside Ethiopia, Europe, America, to develop the ideas and then work to popularize the roadmap inside the country and among the diaspora.
And the goal is to get broad buy-in.
Yes. Those developing it might not be the ones protesting, but they advocate for its acceptance by civil society, parties, elites, activists, even the government. If the roadmap gains wide legitimacy, he argues, any future power will feel obligated to implement it. Like land to the tiller became non-negotiable during the revolution.
Creating a widely accepted blueprint that constrains future leaders.
That's the idea. It's about shaping the agenda before the power vacuum opens.
Okay, fascinating. Fikadu also includes some additional ideas at the end. What's the main thrust there?
He starts by reiterating his core concern. Ethiopia keeps treating symptoms, not root causes. Land reform under the Derg addressed class, ethnic federalism addressed ethnicity.
But the problems persist or morph.
Right. Temporary relief, maybe, but new problems emerge or old ones resurface. He keeps asking, have we really understood the root causes? What is the fundamental question? It's a call for deeper diagnosis.
And this leads him to talk about liberating identity. What's his argument there regarding federalism?
He acknowledges federalism brought some benefits: decentralization, cultural promotion, using mother tongues in education and justice. That's positive.
Right.
But, he argues, creating ethnic-based regions has dangerously amplified ethnic nationalism, creating competing political identities. It turned local disputes into larger regional ethnic conflicts. He even apparently cites data suggesting ethnic conflict increased after ethnic federalism was implemented, a huge challenge for stability.
He calls something the original sin of this federalism.
Yes, making ethnic identity the sole, primary identity for 30 years. It became the main channel for accessing power and resources.
And the problem with that is?
Citizens have multiple identities: gender, religion, profession, region. Why should ethnicity automatically trump everything else? He argues the system suppressed these other identities in the name of liberating ethnic identity.
And the definition of ethnic identity itself was problematic.
Yeah, he feels it lacked a focus on citizens' free will or self-definition. It became rigid, exclusionary.
He contrasts the Ethiopian constitution's preamble with others, like Switzerland's.
Right. Ethiopia starts, "We the nations, nationalities, and peoples," framing the social contract between the state and ethnic groups. Many others start, "We the people citizens," framing it between the state and individuals with multiple identities.
And citizenship being tied to ethnicity by lineage.
Narrows the path, makes it exclusionary, he argues. He wants to liberate citizenship from this tight link to ethnicity, recognize people's freedom to define themselves, acknowledge multiple identities, and build a social contract on that basis.
What about language policy under this system?
He finds it ironic. Despite ethnic federalism, he says there hasn't been a clear national language policy. Using mother tongues is a benefit, sure, but he argues you don't necessarily need ethnic borders to do that.
And he uses Switzerland again as an example.
Yes. 26 cantons, 4 language regions, many cantons sharing languages. German, French, Italian are equal national languages. Roman speakers get services too. Cantons choose their own official languages, 1, 2, or even 3, like Graubünden.
What are the lessons for Ethiopia from Switzerland, according to Fikadu?
2 main things. Shared language doesn't require shared borders, And federal and regional governments can adopt multiple official languages based on local realities and research. It allows for flexibility.
He also touches on levels of autonomy, saying the Ethiopian model might paradoxically marginalize some minorities.
Yeah, he uses the example of the former Southern Nations region, huge diversity, broken down into tiny zones and districts for autonomy. He questions if that hyperfragmentation was really effective or just created more complexity and potential for conflict.
So he prefers more flexibility and autonomy levels.
Seems so. He suggests needing varying levels based on different regions' needs and desires. He points to places like Quebec in Canada, with its distinct status, or arrangements in Belgium or India as examples of asymmetrical federalism.
And finally, he comes back to the language used in the system itself.
Yes, the very names. Calling regions, Amharic regions, Somali region, etc., inherently links territory to ethnicity. This extends down to local levels. Some regional constitutions even use terms like native or founder, which can exclude minorities within those regions.
Unlike Switzerland's neutral canton.
Exactly. Ficado argues the language used in administration and politics needs to be much more careful to avoid constantly reinforcing these ethnic divisions. Words matter deeply in shaping identity and belonging.
Wow, okay. That's a lot to process. We've gone through Eyasped's ideas, Ficado's detailed critique focusing on authoritarianism and civic rights, the challenges facing political parties, the role of public movements, and this need for a deeper look at identity and federalism itself.
It really highlights the complexity, doesn't it? The debate isn't simple. Is it primarily about resolving ethnic grievances through structures like federalism, or is it more about fundamental changes in governance, building checks and balances, and fostering a shared civic identity that transcends ethnicity? Ficado clearly leans towards the latter, but acknowledges the power of the former.
So as you listening navigate all the information out there on Ethiopian politics, it's really helpful to keep these deeper questions in mind, right? Questions about state legitimacy, how identity is constructed and mobilized, the actual mechanics of political power. It gives you a much richer perspective than just following the day-to-day headlines.
Absolutely. Understanding these underlying dynamics, the historical narratives, the identity politics, the governance structures, the potential for popular movements is key to making sense of it all.
It leaves us with a big question, though. Considering this incredibly intricate interplay of history, identity, and governance that we've unpacked, what single factor do you think holds the most significant key to unlocking a more stable, maybe more prosperous future for Ethiopia?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? There's probably no single key, but thinking about which factor might be the most pivotal, well, that's definitely something to mull over.